Welcome everyone to Tuesday Tea Time with Elsa. Today we have Ari over there making faces at Ocasio. And I don't know if you can see, but ever so slightly it is snowing. There's little bits of snow following all around us. And that's pretty unusual for San Juan Island. We don't get a lot of snow in the winter here. So I thought I would talk this week a little bit about environmental factors. And, well, obviously that's what's on my mind. It's snowing. Tea time, I actually brought a blanket out to sit on today. And I've still got the horses eating hay behind me. But everything's a little bit different when the environment changes dramatically. And the first place I noticed this is in the patience they have for each other. So these guys are really good friends. Ari and Ocasio spend a lot of time together. Ocasio has a high play drive. He's always pushing Ari to play more. He's always pushing Ari to set boundaries. But what I find is when the environment changes dramatically, stress levels go up. And it doesn't mean snow is bad. It means that snow is unusual for us in this particular area. So we don't see it very often. And when something happens that you don't see very often, the stress goes up. And so Ari is a little quicker to be angry with Ocasio than he is when the weather is good. Or when the weather is normal, I should say. It's not really good or bad. It's normal or more strange. And I've just been exploring a new theory about this. This idea that stress is always going up or coming down. It sort of goes in a wave. It's up and down all the time. And there's a functional level in the middle where we're really good friends to each other. When stress gets a little bit too high, you're going to see fight and flight. We run away from each other or we pick fights. We need someone else to fix it for us. When stress is too low, we fall asleep and we stop paying attention to others. What's interesting here is these two, they're really good friends. And even though the weather's changed, it's snowing a little bit, and Ari is quicker to be angry with Ocasio. If you guys listened to my tea talk last week, I was talking about boundaries. Ocasio actually really likes it. He actually seems really comfortable to have somebody setting really clear boundaries. So it doesn't stop him from pushing right into Ari's space. But it is interesting for me to be around because I have to be more aware if I am comfortable with it. So when the weather changes dramatically, you get a rise in stress. And when you get a rise in stress, you get more fight or more flight. And this is just something that we have to be aware of. When weather is normal, when it's something that you're used to, it's the same every day, the horses find an equilibrium. They find a balance with it. And they can settle into a really functional stress level. When you get a dramatic change, here's what I think happens. The brain can take in a certain number of pieces of information, but it can take in a lot more pieces of information than it can actually process. So you're not actually able to think about all the things that you observe. If you have the type of brain that can sort out what's important and what's not important, then you stick with a number of things your brain is actually capable of processing. And that feels fine. It keeps you in a functional stress level. When you try and process too many pieces of information, what happens is you get overwhelmed. And when you get overwhelmed and that feeling of overwhelmed comes in, it's too much. Your brain cannot process that much information all at one time. Then you start to fight back. And this is what I see with the horses all the time. When they get overwhelmed, they either have to fight back or they have to run away. And I think in the human world, this is one of the reasons we talk about meditation being so valuable. Meditation calms your brain down, and when your brain calms down, it can pick apart which things are important and which things are not important. And that stops us from getting overwhelmed. When we can't pick apart which piece is important and which piece is not important, we become overwhelmed. And when we become overwhelmed, it's really hard not to become dysfunctional and start fighting with our friends or running away from our friends. Yeah, exactly, George, just like a high-stress job. Now, in an ideal world, we develop the brain's capability to the point where it can take a high stress environment or a high amount of change and it can sort it out. This part is important, this other part is not important. I'm going to focus on the pieces that I can deal with, and then you don't feel overwhelmed. And if you don't feel overwhelmed, you don't have to fight, you don't have to run away. You can functionally sort through, organize, understand all the pieces you need. Hi, Florentine. I'm so glad you're here for tea time. So this is a really helpful way for me to think about it. When my horses are showing a little bit too much fight or flight, it's really fun for me if I can understand why. If it just started snowing and it never snows here, that's a fairly obvious piece. And it adds to the amount of information they're taking into their brain. If it's not a piece of information they're taking in every day, they start trying to process too many pieces of information all at the same time. And when they're trying to process too many pieces of information, they get overwhelmed, they have to fight back, or they have to run away. So our job when we're training horses is to assess the situation, see the amount of information that is flooding into a horse's brain, and then think about how we can influence that. How can we influence them to be able to sort through it? This piece of information is important for me to think about. This other piece of information is not important for me to think about. I can stop paying attention to this piece, and I can only pay attention to this piece. When they can sort through what's important and what's not important, then they don't get overwhelmed. But when you have an environmental event like it's starting to snow, there's a lot of new information, and the horse has to adjust. Which piece of this new information is vital for my well-being, and which piece of information can I ignore, forget, not think about? So you can see both horses just alerted to something up in the trees. Okay, that seemed very important to them for a minute. Big sigh from Ocasio. He's starting to let it go. You can see Ari let it go much more quickly. Ocasio gets overwhelmed much more often than Ari does. And it's because he has a harder time sorting out which pieces of information are vitally important and which pieces of information are extra. Now, you can see Ari came back to look at the woods again, and then he went back to eat the food again. This switching back and forth from one category of attention to another is one of the factors I think is really important when horses are sorting through what's important and what's not important. When horses overly fixate on one subject, they get stuck. And when they get stuck on one subject, every little detail about that subject becomes overwhelming. If there's a deer walking through the woods up there, what noises is it making? What direction is it facing? Is it moving slowly? Is it moving quickly? How far away is it? Are the trees between us and it? Do they have any birds in it? Are the birds making calls? There's a million little details about that one piece that can become very overwhelming. Yeah, OCD, George, it is like OCD. You get so overwhelmed by all the details that the emotions start to misfire. You get really overwhelmed and you can't relate to your friends anymore. But if you can look up in the woods, notice there's a deer. Look, as you can see, Ari here is looking back behind him. He's checking out a different piece of the environment. And the question with overwhelm is, how stuck is he going to get in that focus? If he gets really stuck, he's going to get really overwhelmed. And so if he can come back to chewing, you can see the hay starting to appear around the corner there. He's chewing again. If he can change his focus to something else, what that does is it helps his brain sort through what's important and what's not. There he goes back to eating. He has a little moment for the synapses in his brain to calm down, to move away from the thing that made him hyper-focus. And then he's going to look up again and check something else. This is far more hyper-focus than I would normally see from Ari. And I think it's because of the environmental impact. Our horses are just not used to seeing snow around here. We get snow for a couple of days a year, maybe a week or two. And it's just doesn't happen very often. So when it snows, there's a lot more information that comes into their brains. And they have to figure out how to sort it. What pieces are important, what pieces are not important. And if they can successfully sort through all the information they're getting, then they end up in that functional stress zone where they can respond, cooperate, work with their friends. If they get too much information that they're trying to process, they have to fight or run. Laurent says, windy, windy Belgium right now. This morning I had to stay outside with my herd for a while. I'm going to have to read the rest of your comment later, Laurence, but yes, you understand what I am talking about. There are a lot of environmental factors, and sometimes we can stay with the horses a little bit and help them change their focus, help them take a breath, help them sort through what is important and what is not important. But having said that, I want to just make the point, we're here to help. We're not here to fix it for them. The horses are fully capable beings. They learn from every experience. The horses, to some extent, need to learn to solve the issues for themselves. So if you have an environmental event and your horses are particularly stressed, remember, it's your job to help, but it is not necessarily your job to fix it for them. Sometimes just living through the event is the education they need to be able to do better with it next time. So that's what I'm trying to remember with my guys right now. Everything we do together is going to be a little bit quieter. I'm going to ask less of them. If they're already overwhelmed with the amount of input coming into their brains, there's a limited amount I can add to that unless I find a way to really lower their stress first. If you can really lower their stress first, then you have more room to add input. So, yeah, Christian, solving the tiny topics themselves and then assisting a bit for moderate topics. And then when it's really hard topics, you may or may not be able to help. It depends on whether the horse will accept your help or not. The hard things where they get really overwhelmed, if you have the right tools, you might be able to help. If you don't have the right tools, you might have to just back off and let them live through it. But you're right, the moderate topics where they're a little bit overwhelmed, we can help with those. The small topics, it's really good to step back and let them manage those for themselves. So, life, it brings us lots of adventures. I had so many plans for this week, and it turns out a lot of my plans are going to go the way of watching the snow with the horses, helping them change focus when I can, and when I can't, being with them in ways that feel like I'm a good friend or a good leader, in the ways that they'll accept it. So I certainly know the bigger the snowflakes, the more aware I have to be with Atlas. It's really interesting. You can actually see a difference in him when the snowflakes get really big. His eyes get really wide, and he literally gets overwhelmed by the sensory input of the snowflakes going past his eyes. the snowflakes are smaller, I have a lot more leeway to add information for him. These guys, Ari and Ocasio, it's not quite as dramatic as it is with Atlas, but it's still something to be aware of. When it's snowing, that's an added environmental input for their brain. To the degree your horse is good at sorting through the input they get and realizing what's important and what's not, is the level of functionality they're going to have being a friend, being a partner, working with you. So those are my thoughts for tea time today. I'm going to continue to enjoy the snow with the horses. And I hope you guys have a wonderful day wherever you are, whatever the weather is. And, if you can, just see if you can help your horses sort through what's important and what they don't have to worry about. There's a limited amount that they can process at any one time. And when that amount that they're processing is low enough, you can add more things for them to process. If the amount of things that they're processing is too high, they might need some help sorting through that. So thank you guys. Have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday.